African American is a culture, just as my shirt says. I do indeed believe it. Now, I understand that some people, as descendants of African slaves brought to America, do not care to identify as African American. Even how we cohesively identify as an ethnic group is up for debate, and that's a whole nother conversation and probably another worthy video topic on its own. But for the ease of this discussion, I'm going to stick with African American. So let's get into how African American is indeed a beautiful ethnicity and culture that has been co-opted, appropriated, and commodified to the point that we have been left with no sacred space, allowing us to be the gatekeepers of any aspect of our own culture. And this is what has bubbled over into a sort of resentment that either leaves us feeling less than, and unfortunately has also fueled discriminatory rhetoric from all sides of the African diaspora. Hey guys, I'm Julesy. If you are new here, please subscribe, because whether you like it, love it, or don't agree at all, this is about encouraging a critical dialogue. So join in and comment along respectfully. Thumbs up, because it helps with engagement. In a previous video about did Africans sell us into slavery, a refrain that I had heard across social media and thought it would be a good point to dig into a more productive conversation from the silly diaspora wars Twitter likes to take on. Because the real point of the conversation was how slavery devastated all sides of the diaspora. You know, I opened that video by explaining why I wanted to address this train of thought that we probably don't hear in real life, but it's been said on the internet, because I will always push back against xenophobia from anyone and everyone. And this African sold us message was being used to push anti-immigrant sentiments, fueling xenophobia from the African American community, or a slither of the African American community. And dear Lord, did that 20 seconds of a 12-minute video entirely derail the comment section. I was accused of beating up Africans' ass. How the hell she live in Houston and not see how Nigerians are xenophobic to us? She doesn't know that we're just trying to carve out a space for ourselves. She doesn't know that we're just trying to preserve our culture because they keep us out of theirs. And sis, hello. I'm African American. Proudly, I love my history and my culture, and I'm still not effing with any sort of discrimination, bigotry, or xenophobia, though I understand why a movement around resentment towards African immigrants and the supposed preservation of our culture can be a thing, unfortunately so. However, understanding is not approval, and there's a much more productive conversation we can be having that does not rest its laurels on dominating another group or pushing out any sort of anti-rhetoric towards any community. So let us discuss here. African American culture has never had the space to hold a piece of itself as sacred. What I mean is, in the way that other communities and cultures can say, you cannot do that, or at the very least, you cannot do that without me bringing you into the fold because you're not from here, we don't seem to have that same cultural privilege. For instance, Yvonne Orji, who is Nigerian and plays Molly on Insecure, had a Nigerian Night of Excellence celebration. Obviously, she honored other Nigerians who were doing notable things in America, the defining eligibility that you had to be of Nigerian descent. On the flip though, Yvonne has participated in the Essence Black Women in Hollywood dinner, Essence being a distinct cultural marker of African American history through the years, and the dinner was honoring Black women breaking barriers in film. It makes sense that she was participating. I don't have an issue with that, but I don't have any comparable offering where I can say an African American can host an African American Night of Excellence that does not include Black people of other descents from other parts of the diaspora. This is absolutely not a function of immigrants taking our place, because we're not attacking the person here. This is going to get us absolutely nowhere. We have to look at the systems, plural, that are at play here, because the system is always a function of white supremacist imperialism and capitalism. Now, we're keeping it basic. So if we take it back to this award dinner and this African American Night of Excellence, right? How do we set the eligibility rules of who can even be honored, who can participate? And I doubt that in 2018, we're at a point yet where we're questioning who gets to identify as Nigerian. Like, we're on our way there. We're not there yet. Immigration en masse to America started within our parents' generation. So at most, you have pretty insular communities that can go back maybe 2, 3, if we being nice, generations. Contrastly, African Americans, a community that's been in America since like the 1600s, can we just say your parents have to be black? Historically, proximity to European phenotypes has pushed a swath of light-skinned, mixed-race black people to the upper echelon, to the top, to the forefront. Are we supposed to keep them out? And before you think to say yes, remember that none of us are consistent with who we say can be black. We're never consistent with our phenotyping. Someone like a Nicole Hannah Jones, who has covered racial segregation in schools, landing her a MacArthur Genius Award, like her identifying as black has happened without much fanfare, even though she has a white mother. Barack, I'm not gonna veer too far off topic here. How much a person has invested in the black community and who they partner with can greatly shape whether we see them as black or not. And to stay on topic, what if a person has 2 or 3 mixed race grandparents, landing them at technically less than 50%, even though they present as black? What if someone has a set of grandparents from the Caribbean, but they have no correlation to that culture because you were raised as black? And honestly, you would be surprised at how common that is. There has been a migration of Caribbean migrant workers up and down the eastern coastline where dense black populations exist since white men were allowed to own us as chattel. I mean, Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican, Stokely Carmichael was Trinidadian. Plenty of us don't even know much about our grandparents' personal lives to tell you where they were born at or where they came from. We just know where they settled. And so who's gonna do all this verification to say this is how we particularly identify who gets to claim to be African American, who gets to claim to be a part of our ethnicity? Said before, the power of language is not on our side when it comes to talking about race in America. You know, when we start these conversations, do we all even understand that black is a race, African American is the ethnicity, American is a nationality, then we have Black American, which one can argue is absolutely a nationality, and maybe a burgeoning reshaping ethnicity unto itself. And as much as you might want to claim it only for descendants of African slaves in America, and bro, what is America? Because technically North America is the Caribbean and Central America. What are we doing here? Black American is typically used for the shared experience of being black in America, generally speaking. You know, this is complicated because there are many nuances I want to acknowledge, but even with the simplicity of like looking at how we would host a celebratory award dinner for African Americans, if we wanted to make a sacred space for our culture and ethnicity, how are we defining those guidelines in a way that's consistent and universally applicable? How do we define those guidelines without tail spinning into a constant point of frustration and arguments amongst ourselves? I wholeheartedly understand the frustration of watching other cultures come over and have easy access to partake in our culture. That is not a two-way street at all. Particularities of how immigration functions with African nations and colonialism and imperialism and all of that leads us to the derision between the most populous African immigrant community in America, Nigerians, and African Americans. Because what we're talking about when we claim to be preserving our culture or carving out a sacred space for us is entangled with classism and economic frustrations. So yes, even for me, it's interesting to watch like Nigerians take over a chapter, well really the whole entire frat, but to see them take over a chapter of the first African American fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, which is a bastion of African American culture that's derived from the Divine Nine and their history in our community, but to see them take it over while still holding on to xenophobic beliefs against African Americans. You know, I have more than my fair share of conversations, particularly in Houston, with folks about how you just cannot think that your culture is better than mine, particularly when you are participating and benefiting from my culture. You know, we are both cute, we both good, and if you believed all that, why would you pledge in the first place? We welcomed you into an elite function of our culture, so don't turn your nose up now. But there are ways for both of us to be proud about our culture and respect our culture, and because you're participating in it, I mean, you have an obligation to learn the history. Like how How you pledge anyway? I really want us to get away from this belief that anyone is taking up space, because we should not be fighting to keep the spaces and accesses in this country so narrow that a less than 3% representation, whether it's in colleges, in the classrooms, boardrooms, or wherever, leaves us pointing to each other like, why are you taking up my spot? When the question should be, why are there so few spots to begin with? How does your institution participate and profit from slavery, but not invest in providing equity for the communities you pillaged? It's not that you are concerned with the amount of immigrants that are at a college. You should be concerned with why these institutions and these systems that benefited from our community are not in turn going back into the community that they benefit from to provide equity. Why isn't the space wider? Why isn't it more open? Why are you, the system, not doing the work? Because truthfully, there's enough money, there's enough space for all of us to coexist, but we all gotta acknowledge that this country has been built on policy and infrastructure purposefully stifles the Black community. That ain't none Black person's fault. It's the colonizer's fault. It's the government, it's the system, it's these institutions that exist. Let's get away from focusing so much on immigrants, because even if there were no immigrants in this country, this would not absolve the issue of co-opting and commodifying our culture to the point where we can't hold any of it sacred, because like, what are white people? The colonizer. Even aside from white people, there is a wrongly held shame from some of us who believe that we are less than because our ancestors were slaves. We don't feel validated because we don't have a name for the ethnicity that feels distinct to us. And I get it, it's not fun. You know, I've had several times I've had like a North African say to me that they're more African than I am, so they should be calling themselves African American, not me. And I'm just like, shukran, afwan, voila, move on. Not entertaining the BS. For many of us that have never traveled out of the country, it is common to not see ourselves or be comfortable with calling ourselves American, because that conjures up images of whiteness that don't represent ourselves. We then have no attachment to Africa, which is why you get this pushback against the terminology African American. You know, we want a nomenclature that's as distinctive as Zulu or Kikuyu or Fulani. So we stick with Black because that's the closest thing we have, but because nothing can be distinctive if it doesn't come with an etymology that traces back to before the white man 1432. The Jesse Jackson campaign for this term in the 1980s makes some of us feel like, dang, it's not authentic. There is definitely this air that because our culture coalesced largely in the 1900s, it's too new to be validated. They're not the only community to have our culture co-opted. You just ask Native Americans, Mexicans, hell, Jamaicans. It's just that, you know, particularly for Jamaicans, they have the benefit of being from a Black majority country where our language and manner of speech is looked down upon because we live in a white majority society. Black majority society can see a sort of pidgin or whatever non-English language flourish as a way of building up a society, unlike our options in America. But that in and of itself only goes but so far, because white supremacy will always rear its ugly head and it will nip that in the bud. But it gives a veneer of them having sort of a stronger culture because there's more of a unified language that they share amongst each other. So we just have to understand what we're actually looking at when we're comparing our cultures to others. There is a lot of African American history and culture to be proud of. Jumping the broom, eating black-eyed peas on New Year's, hanging glass on branches, Earth, Wind, and Fire, and HBCU marching bands, Black liberation, Black feminism, mysticism, and Afrofuturism, Twinkie Clark and the Church of God in Christ, AME Zion, Black Baptist, you know, the uniqueness of the Black church. We may not have many ceremonies, gods, or chiefdoms, but we have a culture and we can hold on to it by respecting it, by learning its history, and by not expecting our energy to attack individuals. Because when we attack individuals, there's no way for us to even begin to be consistent. We're just gonna find ourselves on hamster wheels of never-ending frustration that largely leads us nowhere. It ain't making us no money, it ain't benefiting our health, it ain't benefiting our understanding of our own culture and history. It's such a waste of time. I know it feels like there's no positive resolve here. We come from one of the most influential cultures in the world. Globalism gives everyone access to the cool factors while leaving us with the loneliness of the unique generational trauma we have to overcome as African Americans. But as other cultures push representation in the mainstream, as globalism gets a hold of them, as capitalism strips their cultural practices for marketability, this will, and it already is becoming an issue for other communities. We just don't happen to live in that space to know or understand firsthand. I'm just gonna keep pushing that instead of dragging folks on Twitter, fighting the air over random people that really ain't got nothing to do with your life, that we focus on learning our history, our culture, and extolling pride within our households and our communities. Learning to love all Black people, including the poor, because they are a very large part of our culture, and not just the blavely Black folks, not just the folks that have a veneer or a sheen of wealth and have pretty pictures on Instagram, or who feed into the same political ideologies that you do, but really learning to uplift our whole community and what that looks like. And I promise, it will work out for itself. And I'm looking forward to the expansion and the evolution of our culture, especially as more of us learn the history that precedes us, and it informs the steps we take going forward. All right. Thanks for watching. Deuces.